It was no very unusual thing for Inspector Stroud of Scotland Yard to look in on us of an evening, and his visits were always welcome to Holmes, since they kept him in touch with everything happening at police headquarters. In exchange for whatever news Lestrade brought, Holmes was generally happy to listen to the details of whatever case the inspector happened to be working, and would occasionally offer some observation drawn from his own considerable experience, without ever quite calling it help. On this particular evening, Lestrade had talked of the weather and the newspapers for some time, before falling into a thoughtful silence, puffing at his cigar, with the particular stillness of a man turning something over in his mind. "Anything remarkable on hand?" Holmes asked him. Lestrade said there was nothing very particular, and then laughed at himself, and admitted there was in fact something bothering him, though it was such an absurd business he had hesitated to raise it. He said he suspected it belonged more in my line than in his or Holmes's. "Disease?" I asked. "Madness," he said, "and a strange madness at that." He wondered aloud whether anyone still alive could possibly hate the memory of Napoleon so intensely that he would smash any likeness of the man he came across. Holmes said that sounded like no business of his. Lestrade agreed, but said that when the man in question commits burglary in order to smash images that don't even belong to him, that moves the matter out of my department and into yours. Holmes sat up at that, and Lestrade took out his notebook. The first incident, he said, had occurred 4 days earlier at the shop of a picture and statue dealer named Morse Hudson on Kennington Road. The assistant had stepped away from the front of the shop for a moment when he heard a crash, and returned to find a plaster bust of Napoleon, one of several ornaments on the counter, smashed to fragments. He ran into the street. Several passers-by came to have seen a man running away, but no one could identify him. The plaster cast had been worth only a few shillings, and the whole affair had seemed too trivial for any real investigation. The second incident, Lestrade said, had been more serious, and stranger still, it had happened only the previous night. A well-known local physician named Dr. Barnicot, an enthusiastic collector of Napoleon memorabilia, had purchased 2 identical plaster busts from Morse Hudson some time before, keeping one in the front hall of his house on Kennington Road and the other on the mantelpiece of his branch surgery 2 miles away in Lower Brixton. That night, someone had broken into his house and taken nothing except the bust in the hall, which they carried outside and smashed against the garden wall. The surgery had been broken into as well, its window forced, and the second bust found shattered on the floor of the room where it stood. Holmes asked whether the 2 busts destroyed at Dr. Barnicot's had come from the exact same mold as the one broken at Morse Hudson's shop. Lestrade confirmed they had. Holmes said that fact worked against any theory of a general hatred of Napoleon, since London surely held hundreds of such busts, and its strained belief that a random iconoclast would happen to begin with 3 specimens cast from the very same mold. Lestrade said he had reasoned the same way, but pointed out that Morse Hudson's shop supplied most of busts in that part of London, and these 3 had apparently been the only ones on his premises for years. A local fanatic, in other words, might simply have started with what was nearest to hand. I offered that there were no real limits to the possibilities of monomania, that French psychologists had a term for it, an idée fixe, which could exist quite separately from any other form of madness, and that a man with some inherited grievance connected to the Napoleonic Wars might well develop such a fixation. Holmes shook his head. No amount of idée fixe, he said, would tell a man where in London these particular busts happened to be sitting. I asked how he explained it then. He said he didn't, not yet. He only observed there was a definite method in the man's behavior. In Dr. Barnicot's front hall, where any noise risked waking the household, the bust had been carried outside before being broken. In the surgery, where there was less danger of alarm. It had been smashed exactly where it stood. He said the whole business seemed trivial on its face, but he had learned never to dismiss anything as trivial, reminding me that one of his most serious cases had begun with nothing more than the depth to which some parsley had sunk into a dish of butter on a hot afternoon. He asked Lestrade to bring him word of any further developments in so curious a chain of events. The development came far sooner and in a far darker form than any of us could have anticipated. I was still dressing the following morning when Holmes came into my room with a telegram in his hand. He read aloud, "Come instantly, 131 Pitt Street, Kensington. Signed, Lestrade." I asked what it meant. He said he didn't know for certain, but suspected it was the next chapter in the story of the statues, our image breaker having apparently moved his operations to a new part of London. There was coffee waiting, he said, a cab already at the door. Within half an hour, we had reached Pitt Street, a quiet backwater tucked just beside one of the busier arteries of the city. Number 131 was one house in a row of flat-fronted, respectable, entirely unremarkable dwellings, except that this particular one had a curious crowd gathered along its railings. Holmes gave a low whistle at the sight of it and observed, before we had even stepped down, that nothing short of a serious act of violence would hold a London street crowd in place like that. Lestrade met us at the door with a grave face and showed us in to where an unkempt, visibly shaken elderly man in a flannel dressing gown was pacing the sitting room. He was introduced as Mr. Horace Harker, a journalist with the Central Press Syndicate and the owner of the house. "It's the Napoleon bust business again," Lestrade said, "but it's taken a much graver turn." Harker turned to us with a face of pure misery and said it was a strange thing that a man who had spent his whole career collecting other people's news should find himself, now that real news had landed on his own doorstep, too rattled to string two words together. He said he had heard Holmes's name and hoped that if Holmes could explain this business, he would at least be compensated for trouble of telling his story yet again. His account, once he settled into it, was this. He had bought a Napoleon bust some months earlier for the very room we sat in. Much of his work as a journalist was done through the night, and he had been sitting in his upstairs study around 3 in the morning when he thought he heard sounds from downstairs. The sounds did not repeat, and he assumed they came from outside. Then, some 5 minutes later, there had come a scream unlike anything he had ever heard in his life, one he expected would stay with him for the rest of it. He had sat frozen for a minute or two before finally seizing a poker and going down. He found the window of his study standing open and the bust gone from the mantelpiece. Realizing that anyone leaving through that window could reach the front step with a single long stride, he went round and opened the front door and nearly fell over a dead man lying just outside it. He had run back for a light. The man was on his back, knees drawn up, throat torn open, the whole step swimming in blood. Harker had managed to blow his police whistle before fainting entirely, and remembered nothing further until he woke to find a constable standing over him. There was, Lestrade told us, nothing yet to identify the dead man. He was tall, sunburned, powerfully built, no more than 30, poorly dressed, but with none of the bearing of a laborer. A horn-handled clasp knife lay in the blood beside him, though whether it belonged to him or his killer was not yet clear. There had been no name on his clothing, nothing in his pockets but an apple, a length of string, a shilling map of London, and a small photograph. Lestrade handed it to Holmes. It showed a sharp, alert, simian sort of face, heavy-browed, with a peculiar jutting quality to the lower jaw that put me in mind of nothing so much as a baboon. Holmes studied it carefully and asked what had become of the missing bust. Word had just come in, Lestrade said. It had been found smashed in the front garden of an empty house on Campden House Road, not far away. We went to see it. It lay scattered across the grass in splintered fragments, the same wide, placid plaster face that had apparently provoked such violence in someone. Holmes picked through the pieces slowly, and I could see from the set of his jaw that something in the wreckage had caught his interest. "We have a long ways to go," he said finally, "and yet we have a few suggestive facts. This trifling object was apparently worth more to our man than a human life. That is the first, and there is a second, equally strange. He did not break it inside the house, nor immediately outside it." Lestrade looked around at the row of houses. It was an empty house, he offered. He could smash it without fear of being disturbed. "There is another empty house farther up this very street," Holmes said. "One he must have passed on his way here. Why not stop there, since every additional yard he carried it only increased his risk of being seen?" Lestrade admitted he couldn't say. Holmes pointed upward to the street lamp standing directly over the spot where the fragments lay. "He could see what he was doing here," Holmes said. "He could not have seen it there." "We have, Watson," he said as we turned away, "a rather long and complicated day ahead of us." We walked together to the High Street, where Holmes stopped at the shop of Harding Brothers, from whom the murdered man's bust had originally come. A young assistant told us that Mr. Harding himself would not be back until afternoon, and that he, being new to the position, could tell us nothing useful. I could see the disappointment settle over Holmes's face. "Well, well," he said, as we stepped back out onto the street. "We can't expect everything to fall our way at once, Watson. We shall have to return this afternoon. In the meantime, I am trying to trace each of these busts back to its source, in the hope of finding something peculiar in their history that might account for their remarkable fate. Let us see what Mr. Morse Hudson of Kennington Road can tell us." An hour's drive brought us to the picture dealer's establishment. Morse Hudson proved to be a small, stout man with a red face and a decidedly peppery manner, who launched into his account almost before we had finished introducing ourselves. "Yes, on his very own counter," he said, as if the injustice of it still stung. What did anyone pay rates and taxes for, he wanted to know, if any ruffian could walk in and destroy a man's goods? He called it a nihilist plot. No one but an anarchist, he said, would go about smashing statues, and he used the words Red Republican with considerable relish. As for where he'd gotten the busts, he saw no reason it should matter. But if he really wanted to know, he'd bought them from Gelder and Company of Church Street, Stepney, a respectable firm of 20 years standing. He had ordered 3. 2 had gone to Dr. Barnicot. The 3rd had been the one smashed on his own counter. Holmes produced the photograph. Hudson's manner shifted at once. "Why, that's Beppo," he said, "an Italian pieceworker who'd done odd jobs around the shop, carving, gilding, framing. Left his employment the week before, and Hudson hadn't heard a word from him since. He knew nothing of where the man had come from or gone to. He'd had no complaints about him while he worked there. And Beppo," he added, "had been gone a full 2 days before the first bust was ever smashed." "Well," Holmes said once we were back outside, "that's about all we could reasonably hope to get from Morse Hudson. We have Beppo now as a common thread between Kennington and Kensington, which was worth the drive. Now, Watson, on to Gelder and Company, the source of all these busts. I have a feeling we won't leave empty-handed." We passed through fashionable London, Hotel London, theatrical London, commercial London, and finally out into the maritime districts along the river, arriving eventually at a broad thoroughfare crowded with the tenement housing of 100,000 of Europe's displaced. The sculpture works stood in what had once been the address of wealthy city merchants, a yard full of monumental masonry outside, and within, a large workroom were perhaps 50 laborers carved and molded plaster and stone. The manager, a large blonde German, answered every question Holmes put to him with businesslike clarity. His ledger showed that hundreds of casts had been taken from a marble original of Divine's head of Napoleon, and that the batch sent to Moss Hudson a year before had been half of a set of 6, the other 3 going to Harding Brothers of Kensington. He saw no meaningful difference between these 6 and any of the hundreds of others they had produced, and laughed outright at the notion that anyone would have reason to single them out for destruction. He explained the manufacturing process for us, how each bust was cast in 2 separate molds, one for each side of the face, then joined and left to dry on a table in the passage before being stored. Then Holmes showed him the photograph, and the man's whole manner changed. His face went red with anger, his brow knotting over pale Germanic eyes. "The rascal," he said. He knew him well. It was, he said, the only time in the establishment's respectable history that police had ever need to be called, and it was over this very man. More than a year earlier, Beppo had knifed another Italian in the street, then run straight to the factory with the police at his heels, and been taken into custody right there on the premises. What had he received for it? Holmes asked. The victim had lived, and Beppo had gotten off with a single year. The manager assumed he was out again by now, though he hadn't dared show his face back at the works. He mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that a cousin of Beppo still worked there and might know where to find him. Holmes cut him off sharply. "Not a word to the cousin," he said. "Not one word." He explained that the matter was of considerably greater importance than it appeared, and grew more important the further they followed it. He asked the manager to check the exact date the busts had been sold to Morse Hudson. The ledger gave the 3rd of June the previous year. Then he asked for the date of Beppo's arrest. The manager worked it out from the pay records. Beppo's last wages, he found, had been paid on the 20th of May. Holmes thanked him and said he needn't take up any more of the man's time, though he asked once more, firmly, that nothing be said of our visit. We snatched a late lunch at a restaurant on the way back across the city, where a news bill outside announced Kensington outrage, murder by a madman. Mr. Harker, it seemed, had gotten his story into print after all, 2 full columns of it, breathless and florid. Holmes propped the paper against the cruet stand and read it while he ate, chuckling once or twice. "This suits us very well," he said. "Listen to this." He read aloud a line assuring readers that both Scotland Yard and the well-known consulting expert Sherlock Holmes agreed the whole grotesque sequence of events sprang from lunacy rather than deliberate crime, no other explanation being able to cover the facts. "The press," he said, folding the paper closed, "is a genuinely useful institution, provided one knows how to make use of it." We returned to Harding Brothers that afternoon and found Mr. Harding himself in, a brisk, dapper little man with a clear head and a ready tongue. He confirmed he'd sold 3 busts from the same batch, one to Mr. Harker himself some months back, one to a Mr. Josiah Brown of Laburnum Lodge in Chiswick, and one to a Mr. Sandeford of Lower Grove Road, Reading. He did not recognize the face in the photograph, though he agreed it was not a face one would easily forget. He mentioned, when Holmes asked, that several Italians worked among his own staff and cleaners, and that there was nothing in particular stopping any of them from glancing through the sales ledger if they were curious enough to look. Holmes took careful notes throughout, and I could tell from his manner that things were falling into place exactly as he'd hoped. He said nothing more, only that we had best hurry if we meant to keep our appointment with Lestrade. We found the inspector already at Baker Street, pacing the floor in a fever of impatience, wearing the particular self-satisfied look of a man convinced he'd had the better day. "Well," he demanded, "what luck, Mr. Holmes?" Holmes said we'd had a busy day, and not an entirely wasted one, that we had now traced every one of the 6 busts from manufacture to sale. The busts, Lestrade said, with open scorn. You do have your own methods, Mr. Holmes, and I won't say a word against them, but I believe I've done rather better today. I've identified the dead man. You don't say, Holmes replied with an expression of polite interest that gave nothing away. And found a motive for the murder besides, Lestrade said. Splendid, said Holmes. Lestrade explained that a colleague specializing in the Italian quarter had recognized the victim on sight. His name was Pietro Venucci from Naples, a man well known to police as one of the most dangerous figures in that community, connected to the mafia, the secret society that enforced its own decrees through murder. Given the Catholic emblem found round his neck and his coloring, the connection had seemed obvious once the identification was made. Lestrade laid out his theory with evident pride. The other man, the one in the photograph, was likely also connected to the mafia and had broken some rule of the organization. Pietro had been assigned to hunt him down, carrying the photograph to be certain he never struck the wrong man. He had tracked his target, watched him enter Harker's house, waited outside, and in the confrontation that followed, received his own fatal wound instead. How does that strike you, Mr. Holmes? He asked. Holmes clapped his hands together approvingly. Excellent, Lestrade, he said. Truly excellent, though I confess I don't quite see how it accounts for the busts. The busts, Lestrade said, waving the objection away. You cannot get those busts out of your head. Petty larceny, nothing more, 6 months at the very worst. It's the murder that matters, and I assure you I am gathering every thread of it into my own hands. And your next step? Holmes asked. A simple one, Lestrade said. He intended to go with his colleague into the Italian quarter that very evening, find the man in the photograph, and arrest him for murder. Would we care to come along? Holmes said he thought not, that he suspected there was a simpler way to bring the matter to a close. It depended, he admitted, on a factor entirely outside his control, but he liked the odds well enough, 2 to 1 in his favor, that if Lestrade would join us that night, we might lay hands on the man ourselves before morning. In the Italian quarter? Lestrade asked. No, Holmes said. I rather think Chiswick is the more promising address. If you'll come with me tonight, Lestrade, I'll gladly join you in the Italian quarter tomorrow, and no harm will come of the short delay. He suggested we all get a few hours' rest, since he did not intend to leave before 11, and doubted we would see our beds again before morning. Lestrade agreed to stay to dinner and take the sofa in the meantime. Holmes asked me to send for an express messenger, saying he had an urgent letter that needed to go out at once, and then spent the remainder of the evening buried in old newspaper files pulled from one of our storage rooms, emerging at last with a look of quiet triumph on his face, though he told neither of us what he had found. I had followed every step of the investigation as it unfolded, and though I could not yet see where it was leading, I understood well enough that Holmes expected our criminal to make one final attempt on one of the 2 remaining busts, and that one of those 2 now sat in a house at Chiswick. I was not surprised when he told me to bring my revolver. A 4-wheeler was waiting for us at 11, and it carried us to a spot on the far side of Hammersmith Bridge, where Holmes told the cabman to wait. A short walk brought us to a quiet road lined with pleasant houses, each set back in its own grounds. By the light of a street lamp, I read Laburnum Villa on one of the gateposts. The house behind it was dark, except for a single fanlight above the door, casting a faint circle onto the garden path below. The wooden fence separating the grounds from the road threw a deep shadow on its inner side, and it was there that the 3 of us settled in to wait. I fear we're in for a long one, Holmes murmured. We should be grateful it isn't raining. I don't think we dare risk a smoke to pass the time. Still, I'd say it's a fair 2 to 1 chance we'll have something to show for our trouble by morning. The wait proved shorter than his warning had suggested, and it ended in a manner as sudden as it was strange. Without the slightest sound to announce him, the garden gate swung open and a lithe, dark figure came up the path with the quick, low-slung movement of something more animal than man. He passed briefly through the light thrown from over the door and vanished into the black shadow along the side of the house. We held our breath. A gentle creaking reached us, the unmistakable sound of a window being carefully worked open. Then silence again, stretching long enough that I began to wonder if we'd lost him. A flash of dark lantern light showed briefly behind one curtained window, then another, then a third, moving through the house room by room. "Let's get to that window," Lestrade whispered. "We'll take him as he climbs back out." But before any of us could move, the man reappeared in the doorway on his own, something pale clutched under one arm. He paused, looking carefully in every direction. The silence of the empty street seemed to satisfy him. He turned his back to us, set his burden down on the step, and a moment later came the sharp crack of a blow, followed by the clatter of falling fragments. He was so absorbed in what he was doing that he never heard us cross the grass. Holmes went at him with the sudden spring of a hunting cat, and an instant later, Lestrade and I each had a wrist, and the cuffs were locked before the man fully understood he'd been taken. As we turned him over, I found myself looking down into a hideous, sallow face, twisted with fury, and knew at once it belonged to the man from the photograph. But it was not our prisoner who held Holmes's attention. He had already crouched down over what the man had carried out of the house, examining the wreckage with total concentration. It was another bust of Napoleon, shattered into fragments, much like the one we'd seen that morning. Holmes held each piece up to the light in turn, but found nothing to distinguish it from any other broken plaster. He had only just finished when the hall lights came up, the front door opened, and a stout, cheerful-looking man in shirt-sleeves stepped out to meet us. "Mr. Josiah Brown, I take it," Holmes said. The man confirmed it, and said he'd received the note Holmes sent by express messenger and had followed the instructions exactly, locking every door from the inside and waiting to see what would happen. He seemed genuinely delighted we'd caught the man and invited us all in for refreshment, which Lestrade declined, being eager to get our prisoner into secure custody. The man said nothing at all on the ride back to London, only glared at us from beneath a tangle of matted hair, and once, when my hand strayed too close, snapped at it like something half-starved. At the station, we learned a search of his clothing had turned up only a few shillings, a long sheath knife, its handle still marked with what looked like recent blood. Lestrade seemed thoroughly satisfied as we parted for the night, confident his theory about the mafia connection would hold, and generous enough to say he was grateful for the workmanlike way Holmes had helped bring the man in, even if he didn't yet fully follow the reasoning behind it. "I fear it's rather too late an hour for explanations tonight," Holmes told him. "Besides, there are one or two loose threads left, and this is a case worth finishing properly. Come by Baker Street at 6 tomorrow evening, and I believe you'll find there's considerably more to this business than either of us has grasped so far." By the time we reconvened the following evening, Lestrade had gathered a fair amount on our prisoner. His name was Beppo, surname unknown, a familiar figure among the local Italian community with a reputation for trouble. He'd once been a genuinely skilled sculptor, earning an honest living before drifting into worse habits, and had already served 2 terms, one for petty theft, one for the stabbing we'd already heard about. He spoke fluent English, but refused to say a single word about his reasons for destroying the busts. The police had discovered, however, that he might well have made the very busts he was destroying with his own hands, since he'd been employed doing exactly that kind of work at Gelder and Company. Holmes listened to all of this with polite attention, though I could see, knowing him as well as I did, that his mind was somewhere else entirely, a curious mixture of restlessness and anticipation beneath his composed exterior. Then, quite suddenly, He sat forward, eyes brightening. The bell had rung downstairs. A minute later, footsteps on the stairs, and an elderly, red-faced man with grizzled side whiskers was shown in, carrying an old-fashioned carpet bag, which he set carefully on the table. "Is Mr. Sherlock Holmes here?" he asked. Holmes rose with a smile. "Mr. Sandiford of Reading, I presume." The man confirmed it, apologized for the lateness of the trains, and produced a letter Holmes had sent him, offering £10 for the Napoleon bust in his possession. He said he'd been quite mystified as to how Holmes could possibly have known he owned such a thing, and admitted, with evident discomfort, that he'd only paid 15 shillings for it originally, and felt honor-bound to say so before accepting £10 in exchange. Holmes told him the scruple did him great credit, but that he intended to honor the price he'd offered regardless. Sandiford opened his bag and set the bust on our table, whole and unbroken, the same familiar plaster face we'd now seen shattered 3 times over. Holmes counted out a £10 note, had the man sign a paper transferring all rights to the object, thanked him warmly, and saw him out. The moment the door closed, Holmes's manner changed entirely. He took a clean white cloth from a drawer, spread it across the table, and set the bust carefully in the center of it. Then he picked up his hunting crop and brought it down hard across the top of Napoleon's plaster head. The figure shattered. Holmes bent over the wreckage at once, and a moment later straightened with a shout of triumph, holding up a single fragment in which something small, round, and dark sat embedded like a plum in a pudding. "Gentlemen," he said, "allow me to introduce the famous black pearl of the Borgias." Lestrade and I sat in stunned silence for a moment before breaking, without any planning between us, into genuine applause, as if we'd just watched the final act of a well-constructed play. Color rose in Holmes's pale face, and he bowed to us with real pleasure. It was in moments like this, rare as they were, that he stopped being purely the reasoning instrument he preferred to present to the world, and let himself be moved, openly, by simple human admiration. "Yes, gentlemen," he said, once he'd recovered himself. "This is very likely the single most famous pearl in existence, and I have had the good fortune to trace it, through a fairly connected chain of reasoning, from the Prince of Colonna's bedroom at the Dacre Hotel, where it went missing some months ago, to the inside of this, the last of 6 Napoleon busts, manufactured by Gelder and Company of Stepney." He reminded Lestrade of the considerable sensation the pearl's disappearance had caused at the time, and the London police's total failure to recover it, admitting he himself had been consulted then and had made no headway at all. Suspicion had briefly fallen on the princess's maid, an Italian woman known to have a brother living in London, though no connection between the 2 cases had ever been proven. "The maid's name," Holmes said, "was Lucretia Venucci, and I have no doubt whatsoever that the man murdered on Mr. Harker's doorstep 2 nights ago was her brother." He'd gone back through old newspaper files, he explained, and found that Pearl's disappearance had occurred exactly 2 days before Beppo's arrest for violence, an arrest made at the very factory where these 6 busts were being cast at that exact moment. Once you saw the sequence clearly, the rest followed easily enough, even if we were seeing it in reverse order from how it had actually unfolded. Beppo had the pearl in his possession, Holmes said, whether he'd stolen it outright from Pietro, or acted as Pietro's confederate, or simply served as a go-between for Pietro and his sister, hardly mattered now. What mattered was that at the exact moment the police closed in on him for an unrelated act of violence, he'd had only minutes to hide something that would have condemned him utterly if found on his person during a search. 6 plaster busts sat drying in the passage nearby, one of them still soft. Beppo, a genuinely skilled craftsman, had pressed a small hole into the wet plaster, dropped the pearl inside, and smoothed the surface back over so completely that no one would ever have found it by looking. It was, Holmes said, a merely perfect hiding place. But Beppo had gotten a year in prison for the unrelated stabbing, and by the time he was released, his 6 busts had scattered across London, and he had no way of knowing which one held his prize. Shaking wouldn't help, since the pearl had likely bonded directly into the wet plaster as it dried, exactly as we'd found it. The only way to be certain was to break each one open and look. He had worked with considerable patience and ingenuity, Holmes said. Through a cousin still employed at Gelder's, he'd learned which retailers had bought the 6 busts, taken employment with Morse Hudson to get close to the first 3, and found nothing. Through further inquiries, he traced the remaining 3 and gone first to Harker's house in Kensington. It was there that Pietro, who apparently held Beppo responsible for losing the pearl entirely, had caught up with him and been killed in the struggle that followed. If Beppo was working with Pietro, I asked, why would he be carrying his photograph on him? As a way of identifying him to anyone he needed to ask about, Holmes said. That was the obvious explanation. After the murder, he'd reasoned that Beppo would move quickly rather than cautiously, fearing the police might work out his secret before he could finish his search. He couldn't say with total certainty the pearl hadn't already turned up inside Harker's bust, or even that it was definitely the pearl he was hunting at all. But it had been clear enough that the man was searching for something, since he carried the bust well past 2 nearer houses in order to smash it under a working street lamp, where he could actually see what he was doing. With Harker's bust eliminated, Holmes said only 2 remained, and it stood to reason Beppo would go after the closer of the 2 first, which put us at Chiswick with fair odds in our favor. He warned Josiah Brown ahead of time to avoid a second tragedy, and events had played out exactly as hoped. By that point, Holmes had been certain it was the Borgia pearl in question, the murdered man's identity having tied the 2 cases together beyond doubt. Only the reading bust remained, and the pearl, by simple elimination, had to be inside it. We sat quietly for a moment after he finished. "Well," Lestrade said at last, "I've watched you work a good many cases, Mr. Holmes, but I don't believe I've seen a more masterful one than this. We're not jealous of you at the Yard, sir. We're proud of you. There isn't a man there, from the oldest inspector down to the newest constable, who wouldn't be glad to shake your hand." "Thank you," Holmes said, and something in his voice told me he was genuinely moved by it, more than I'd seen him moved by praise in a long while. A moment later, the mask was back in place, and he was entirely himself again, brisk and practical. "Put the pearl in the safe, Watson," he said, "and pull out the papers on the Conk Singleton forgery. Good night, Lestrade. If ever another small problem crosses your path, I'll be glad to offer whatever hint I can."